Well, good afternoon, everyone from Scotland, for a change. I'm delighted to be with you all today. And my name is Attridge, the founder and CEO of Click to Learn. I'll say a little bit more about myself and Click to Learn in a moment, but I wanted just to highlight the somewhat provocative title we have here. I thought you might give me a little bit leeway later on about the actual definition of what I mean by words, but what I wanted to highlight here was the area of assessment that we set out to address, and that is to gain insights into what we mean when we use the term beginner in English language learning. And English language learning, of course, any language, is not something you can encapsulate into easy sequential blocks of learning, and that makes the assessment process somewhat more complex as well. So just to illustrate that, I suspect not many of us are totally fluent in several languages, but we may have indeed quite a smattering of more than two or three. We could perhaps introduce ourselves, we could ask for directions, we could order a meal, a beer or whatever, without actually having any mastery of the language. When it comes to English as the global language, the language that dominates the internet, entertainment, business, and a lot of higher education, then it becomes actually quite important to be able to define what we mean by a beginner. It can be quite misleading. So our challenge was to capture data about the skill level from people who couldn't necessarily read, write, or understand English. And I think it's important to understand how widely diverse that group is. It can include people who have computer science degrees and people who've never used a mouse before. It can include young people, it can include grandparents, it can include those who are very highly educated and those who have had their education interrupted for a variety of reasons. But they all have the same basic need. They need to be able to master the language for a variety of reasons that are often linked to migration and employment. So just a little bit about myself. My background is in education and over quite some considerable time in language schools, in secondary schools, in further education colleges, in teacher training and advisory roles, and about 4 or 5 years spent researching applied linguistics as well. Click to Learn is an edtech company that I set up about 10 years ago in Scotland, and we specialise in applying technology in creative ways to English language learning. And let's face it, we are trying to disrupt the mold a bit. And recently, in the last couple of years, that has become somewhat easier as the whole digital transformation has really gripped the whole of the education sector in ways that they never anticipated before. So let's have a look at the problem here. As you can see, global migration is on the increase, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Clearly, the USA and the UK are by far the most popular destinations for people to migrate to. And what we have noticed, the characteristics, if you like, of this cohort that comes to an English-speaking country is summed up really there in the Department for Education observation that there are many more people in this category at the pre-beginner level than there are further up the scale. And the other constant factor is that the vast majority of these people are looking sooner or later to gain employment in the country that they've moved to. So how can our assessment techniques get these people on the right track to gain proficiency in English and to move on with their lives? So let's look at the options that are currently available. On the top left-hand side there, you see the scale that is used pretty universally, particularly perhaps in Europe, South America and the ASEAN region. It's the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. That's a very simple structure, just 6 levels, dividing learners into beginner, intermediate and advanced. It's widely used by both publishers, education providers and awarding bodies. But as you can see from the description on the right there of what an A1 user is expected to be able to do, it does still require, as it says there, a basic understanding of the language and ability to introduce yourselves and to describe where you live. Now, that frankly is beyond the capability of many of the group that I'm talking about and the group that we concentrated on. So we're going to call them the A0 section of learners, and there are a lot of them. So when we developed a course that was much asked for, in other words, a course for people at this level, it was the obvious thing for us to do to think about how to assess them and how best to direct their learning to the most appropriate material that we could provide. So we looked beyond the CEFR and we came across something that worked much better for us, which is the Pearson Global Scale of English. And as you can see from the slide there, the table, it does actually address the issue that we wanted to, which was to go below A1, and it gives us 90 points to play with as opposed to 6 broad levels. So it's a significant intervention, globally accredited in the whole assessment procedure for language learning, particularly at this level. So we have 90 points to play with, not just 6 levels. So it allows much greater personalization of assessment, and I think that's a principle that we were very keen to adopt. As I said, the group are very, very diverse in their needs and starting levels, and to be able to pinpoint, as you can see from the scale below there, more accurately where the learner is at any one point is a very, very useful tool, both for the learner and the teacher. So I'm going to turn now to explain how we adopted these principles into the design of our own diagnostic assessment at Click to Learn. So here are some of the techniques that we used. I think it's probably important I just put this in context a little bit. We don't simply do assessment. As I said before, we are a specialist provider of English language learning, and we focus on the beginner and intermediate level. So we have 2 large accredited courses at that level, along with various other learning tools, progress tracking, blended learning tools, and so on. But we're going to focus here on the diagnostic test. And I'm going to just run you through some of the techniques, if you like, that we use to try to communicate with this group who simply could not read instructions or listen to instructions. So we have 2 tests, one short, the one you see here, and one full. The short one simply focuses on reading and listening skills, which of course we can also mark. And we introduce throughout whatever we do, a series of icons, if you like. We use iconography to explain things. Fortunately, I have a very talented creative director. So you can see here how we express reading and how we express listening for the learner. Now, when it comes to having the learner interact with our software, then we have a variety of techniques. This one we use at the beginner level. We don't give them any written instructions. We simply produce a little animation, a little GIF, if you like, that explains the principle of drag and drop, and in this case, the matching of uppercase and lowercase letters. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see some fairly unambiguous items of vocabulary. So once the learner has understood the principle of drag and drop, without any instructions, they can simply drag, if they can, the word that matches that picture underneath it. So these are simple techniques to assess vocabulary, assess knowledge of the alphabet, and I'll explain a little bit about how we do audio further on. So here we have a little animation that explains to them that they need to click to listen, and then up pops a keyboard. They may be using a mobile phone or a tablet or a laptop, and we're asking them simply to engage in a text entry exercise accompanied by audio. So we're trying to assess some of their listening skills and some of their reading skills and some of their productive skills as well, using very simple personal information as our starting point. And then on the right there, now they've mastered the concept of text entry, then we ask them to extend that to find out if they have a concept of singular and plural and can actually write without any audio prompt the correct word to describe the picture that they see. We do incorporate some basic numeracy here. So again, once they click the audio, they'll hear a random number that they have to select from the items below simply by clicking on it. Just a very basic assessment of matching audio with the symbol. And here we extend that a little bit further by, again, testing familiar items that they will see and hear and try to match up. And then also in terms of their ability to understand time and to express that by simply choosing the correct clock face. So to look a little bit more objectively at this, what we have developed here is a 101 exactly test items for reading and listening without using instructions, and by simply explaining to the learner through the techniques I've shown you how to conduct the test. Now, because we've got 100 items to play with, that allowed us to split the results into 3 bands. So it gives us a much more granular information, detailed information about where a learner sits. Are they genuinely right at the bottom of the learner journey? In this case, you can see how a learner has only scored band 1. They've scored about 1/3 of the marks, but not anymore. Or are they somewhere in the middle? They maybe have a little smattering, they understand some words, but not terribly much. And then are they at the upper end, in which case they would score a band 3. And they would be approaching then the CEFR scale that I showed earlier. They would be effectively moving into the A1 beginner, not pre-beginner category. And our test is designed in such a way that if the learner can do that, if they score well in the band 3, it automatically pushes them on to the A1 level. The assumption, of course, at the A0 section is that they are not capable of writing extended sentences or even simple sentences, so we don't ask them to do that. They're not capable of listening to an audio prompt and responding through our voice recorder tool with their own response to that. But however, if they move up into the A1 section, then these skills are, they can demonstrate their potential in that as well, and then potentially even moving up to A2. And I'll show you in a minute how we applied that in a particular pilot that we ran. So here are the results, if you like, of an interesting experiment that we ran with an NGO actually in Ahmedabad in India. We were working here with a group of around 50 to 60 youngsters who had no previous exposure to English. Very, very little. They certainly didn't have it as part of their formal curriculum. They were not attending an English medium school. This was in a more rural and more deprived area of India. They were using simply their mobile phone in order to access both the assessment and the subsequent course. And indeed, they had no tutor involvement. So it was an interesting experiment for us to see just how well youngsters and mobile phones can work together to advanced assessment and learning. And those of you who may be familiar with Professor Sugata Mitra's famous hole in the wall experiment in Mumbai will know exactly what I'm talking about. You give youngsters the chance to interact with technology, and it's amazing what they can achieve without any adult telling them what to do. And that was to some extent our experience here as well. So you can see on the right here, the results that we had right at the beginning when we assessed them and used our A0 test. There were over half of them who just scored a band 1. They were at the lower end of the scale, as we would have expected. Halfway through, around about the 3-month stage, and they were encouraged and monitored from our system to use the software on a regular basis. So they were learning at least an hour a day using our basic skills course. And by after about 3 months, they had moved up, or most of them had moved up to band 3. And obviously there was a correlation between the engagement and the amount of time they spent, and of course the results that they achieved. We did, I would like to say, we had a 97% adoption rate. So we were very, very encouraged by that. And that was partly as a result of working also with a partner on the ground to make sure that they were all on track and all logged in successfully. And then after the course, I think the thing that surprised us to some extent was the improvement that they had made at, well, still in the beginner level, but we only had 20% still performing at the lowest level of A0. We had 20% moved up beyond that into the A1 level, and we had a really quite astonishing 60% more or less who'd moved beyond that into the A2 level on the CEFR scale, which is effectively moving towards pre-intermediate. So they had gained a significant amount simply by interacting with the software and having that assessment ability where we could actually track in much more detailed way the progress they were making. Previously, of course, the vast majority of these learners would have been excluded from the testing process, just using the CEFR scale to start with. So here are some of the recognitions that we've gathered over the years for the work we've done in digitizing English language learning. We do like to shake things up a little bit, so we always like to be at the cutting edge of things that are maybe not working as well as they should. So in terms of assessment, I like to point out to my colleagues in the FE sector that there are a variety of benefits in going digital, not just the fact that you can go paperless or they can go green, but they can actually give the learner and themselves much more detailed information about what a beginner actually means and how best to push them forward through that journey, because most of them are very keen to do so. So we're not seeking, obviously, to cut out the whole idea of face-to-face assessment, especially when it comes to assessing speaking skills. There is undoubtedly a benefit if you can actually be face-to-face with someone in a room. But we do feel that our approach and our development of this particular test is more inclusive, more sustainable, and more importantly, it leads to a more positive experience for the learners. They can actually see and feel that progress much more regularly and more consistently than they would otherwise have done. So that's Click to Learn. That's what we're about. And I would like to thank Jeff for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. And there are obviously details there if you would like to get in touch with us about any of the work we're doing. Thank you very much.
And excuse me again. And thank you ever so much for that really interesting session. What I hope, or I believe we presented is something of a sandwich over the last 3 presentations. We've had 2 excellent examples, I think, of real world operational issues of what one in the field of maths or numeracy, one in the field of language, and the filling that sandwich has been the grand challenges, the strategic view and developing national and local strategies for assessment and assessment development. So I'm going to ask Christine and Karen if they care to unmute, because we come to a bit of Q&A, and also ask Avidya and James if they're still around, if they could care to join us, and throw the session open to questions. We've had a few questions that are specific. Oh, had a few questions that are specific to the presentations. And yes, Karen had a question for Anne, which sounds slightly incestuous, but it's good. Can the system give credit where responses include spelling mistakes? So let's start off with a little bit of specific question in there. Can the system give credit where responses include spelling mistakes?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Whenever we have text entry, we always build in a number of margins of safety, if you like. So if a learner, for instance, types a space before they start or types a space at the end, which the computer itself would probably interpret differently, we allow for that. And at this level, where we're not allowing, capitalization is not an issue, for example, we'll accept that. We'll accept, obviously, wrong spelling, although clearly at this level, there's very little left to chance. The example I showed you there, if they misspelled the word buses, but had the idea of a vowel followed by an S, then that would be accepted. So yes, we do try to avoid as much as possible the computer says no response, which is just really frankly useless and negative for everyone.
I was wondering if we could pick up something I think came up really in all the presentations, and that is this area of the personalization of assessment, being able to use information to tailor something which suits the individual learner. And I wondered if our speakers would like to pick up on this and discuss whether they see the pros and cons of personalization of assessment. Anyone like to pick up?
I think it's central to the rapid improvement to pedagogy thread in the grand challenges, which means when we reviewed the literature on sort of pressing areas for improvement in assessment, that came out strongly from the literature in 2018. And it's something that's central to assessment professionals. And, interestingly, I think COVID and the rapid shift to online instruction has really shaken business as usual. Many faculty have created a lot of brief online content that can really support rapid feedback and also just-in-time information delivery. So in terms of moving the needle on that one, this idea that we need to personalize instruction and provide students with tailored content, I think we're at a moment where we're uniquely able to do that. I know that one area of concern for faculty is the amount of work it takes to create an adaptive learning module. But like I said, I think all that content that they've already created, if we can capture it before it all disappears, we could really make some progress.
Yeah, if I could just pick up, Jeff, on what Karen said there, I think that she touched on something really important at the end there. That is the idea of data capture. You have to be able to have the data and know what to do with it in the first place if you're going to then direct the learning to the right learner. We do, obviously you can do that in a partial way. You can try and go down the route of AI, or you can use the data for a human to access and begin to intervene in the process. And we like to use all three. I'm still not entirely convinced about, especially with language learning, when you've got different levels involved, about how well we can use AI. We do build in some adaptive learning to our basic skills course. So we do, and we do it through games actually. So whatever they score on a game, it will give us an indication of their level of ability, and then we will feed them either remedial, if you like, repetition, or something more demanding. But that requires intervention. We can't, at the moment, I think, train a computer to do that for us, because it has to be content driven, and we have to provide the content that we know is appropriate for the learner at that point. So I think it's particularly challenging in language, maybe easier in other subjects which are more objective and less dependent on the personal approach of the learner. So a very interesting area to look at.
Yeah, can we try drill down onto that actually and talk about presenting information, presenting the findings? I know, Karen, Christine, there's a lot in the Grand Challenge project around data visualization and data storytelling, and you mentioned that in your presentation. Do you want to just expand a little bit on this whole area of what we mean by storytelling in this sense and in this sort of project?
Christine, do you want to take that, or do you want me to kick off? Okay. So I'm not that well versed in higher education internationally, but certainly in the United States and Canada, the people making decisions with data oftentimes are data novices, and that goes from faculty being asked to make decisions based on assessment data to provosts and presidents being asked to make decisions on complex data about different programs that are put in place with the goal of supporting student success or learning. And so I think there's a few key features that have been identified that we're working on. The first is you need to allow people to access the data at their level of understanding. So we need experts in the United States. That would be people in offices of assessment or institutional research, and I'm not sure what the international equivalents are. We need those experts who understand the data to parse it in ways that non-experts can access it. So that can be a data story where you, in simple language, explain, this was the big question we had, this was how we measured it, this was the difference that we saw. Sometimes it can be through data visualizations where you actually allow a person without a lot of data skill to use Tableau or other data visualization techniques where they can actually, for example, look at overall outcomes on writing improvement in a cohort, but then have a visualization dashboard disaggregate that out so they can see what are first generation students doing compared to non-first generation students, what are male first generation students, right? So Esther Ben-Simon talks about, if we want to move the needle on equity, that we have to create cultures of inquiry. And one of the barriers to the intelligent use of data for integrated planning is if people feel that they can't access the data, right? And so using visualizations, using stories to make that data accessible and let people who are non-experts sort of ask their own questions of it and dig around in it. Does that, I think I wandered a little bit, but those are some of the threads.
No, that's really interesting. Anne may well be familiar with this, but there's a BBC radio program here that's a weekly program. It's called More or Less, and what it tries to do is to explain numbers and explain the language of statistics and economics and all of those sorts of things. And what it clearly shows, and by the way, I think the COVID pandemic proved this absolutely, the general public really have got a limited grasp of numbers and of language and of technical matters. And with assessment, we're talking about something which is really quite specific and well defined, and you need to understand it. What's your view about how we get the messages over to people who aren't on a day-to-day basis understanding the numbers or the words or the techniques we use?
Is that to me or to Anne?
That's open to everybody, including the delegates here.
I think one key thing that I didn't mention before is statistical significance. Is something that many high-level administrators in higher education don't fully grasp. And so, for example, when you're doing a data story or you're creating data visualizations, creating an easy way, like showing the variability, for example, for those of you who are numbers people, instead of just showing differences in means, actually showing the differences in means with variability bars that make it so that you don't have to be an expert to actually see that the overlap is far greater than the difference. So, that's one thing that I think we can do. And again, that's sort of the idea behind fidelity descriptors, right? Like get people, tell the story where you talk about what went wrong in your implementation, right? Because sometimes really good strategies are dropped because the initial first year data looks poor. But 9 times out of 10, and I'm sure Anne sees this in language learning, the first time you try something, you're going to fail. And it's not necessarily that it's the wrong technique. Oftentimes it's that you didn't quite implement it, right? And that's the other piece that comes in there, looking at promising failures, right? So trying to move the conversations from thumbs up, thumbs down to more nuanced conversations. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? Does this data tell us to keep going because we did something, we messed something up here? Or does this data tell us to pull back?
And Karen, I'm going to kind of add on to that. So, and when Karen was at this institution, she was involved in this. We have something that's called the Scholarship of Assessment that we give $1,000 to faculty members, maybe about 5 to 10 faculty members, to identify something in their classroom that they want to improve upon that will eventually improve student success in their classrooms. So last year we decided to divide it into 2 groups. One was use an assessment for equity, and the other one was a software tool called GradeScope. Typically, those in STEM use that software, and it really is for grading purposes and giving feedback to students to help them improve going forward. And it's a tool that was more helpful, especially for those who have large classes that they teach. This year, we actually did a couple of workshops. We haven't done our second one, but we did our first one. And what we thought about was that, okay, they've collected the information, we've given them the demographics to sort of examine, how students did in their classes. But, for a number of years, I expected that, okay, faculty, they've gotten most of them doctorates, they know how to analyze data. And it's like, yeah, that assumption was probably false on my part. So what we did this year was actually offer a workshop in relationship to data literacy and implementation fidelity, as Karen was suggesting. And so it was a 3-hour workshop where we really walked them through different ideas for them to think about. And Karen, thank you for that, because some of them, they implemented something and it didn't turn out like they wanted. They thought it was going to be positive, and then they just wanted to throw it out. And we're like, wait, we can learn something from this. And so our next workshop is going to be next week. And I was actually over here trying to find the link, which I'll put in the chat, which is a learning improvement community. And actually they have a PDF on how to develop a learning improvement story. A lot of what Karen was talking about is, what did you do? What worked? What didn't? What was the impact? I mean, and it's sort of written in sort of a story like, what's the plot? What's the twist? Which we think is going to be more acceptable to peers and those who read that kind of story.
That's brilliant. Karen's put that link on the chat for everybody.
I actually just put the link to the website, not what Christine was talking about. She reminded me that I meant to do that.
I'll ask Christine to put that out. But I think that brings us nicely to the end of this morning's sessions. Can I thank all of our speakers, and particularly Karen, Christine, and particularly Anne for their contributions. I'm going to bring this to a conclusion this morning.